This is a short series on how to get started with Dungeons & Dragons from the very beginning for both a player and a Dungeon Master. I look at the Player's Guide and Roll20, Dungeons & Dragons Beyond, as well as dip in a little bit to the Monster Manual and the Dungeon Master's Guide. Again, this is for both players and Dungeon Masters from the very beginning because I don't see that many videos. So let's get into it. Now the second part in the series, and this is how to get started as a Dungeon Master. Now, you could buy the Dungeon Master's Guide. It's not necessary. It's not necessary to read the Dungeon Master's Guide to start being a Dungeon Master. I didn't do that when I was in grade 8, and most Dungeon Masters didn't have the Dungeon Master's Guide. Mostly, you can get the rules from the Player's Guide, the Player's Handbook. And nowadays, you can get the rules online as well, the very basic rules, and those are free. So you don't need to buy the Dungeon Master's Guide. What the Dungeon Master's Guide does do is it helps give you more options and a broader scope of how to, I guess, improve your adventures and campaigns. It just kind of guides you through having a much higher understanding of how everything works and how to build a great story for your players. So, if you do happen to purchase the Dungeon Master's Guide, there's a table of contents and it helps you go through it. Basically, it helps you build a world. It helps you create a multiverse. As you can see, that seems like a lot of work. Building a world, creating a multiverse. That's already sort of a non-starter for a lot of people, so don't do it if it sounds like way too much work. Because if you enjoy dungeon mastering, you're eventually going to enjoy doing this. And it's not going to feel like work, and then you'll want to come back to the Dungeon Master's Guide. So, the part 2 is more basic. This gives you a sort of an idea of how to structure adventures and creating characters that your players are going to interact with, and creating environments and what to do between adventures, and it tells you about treasure. Again, that sounds like too much work, don't do it. Come back to it when you start to enjoy it more and you think that you need that stuff in your campaign. Then, part 3 is running the game, Dungeon Master's Workshop, and then there's just a lot of charts and a way to generate random dungeons, that sort of stuff, and monster list, maps, dungeons. Again, any of that sounds like too much work, don't do it. This is just sort of a way, again, I said, of expanding on your ability to create a fun time for you and your players. And I'll point that out, that it's very important that you're not the person that provides your players with fun. You are one of the players yourself, and it's important that you have fun. And it's also important that they have fun, but they are responsible for your fun, and you're responsible for their fun. And everyone should sort of help each other have fun. So, the Dungeon Master's Guide is only essential if you feel it's essential. It's not essential if you don't, so don't bother if you're not interested. The Monsters Manual is a little more essential. There's a lot of free monsters online, and you can find a lot of the stats and stuff like that, but this kind of compiles them all in alphabetical order, and then you have an appendix at the back that gives you, it just tells you what page to find these on. And if I was just starting out as a Dungeon Master, I would start with the Player's Guide, right here, and the Monster Manual, just because it just has a lot of monsters in it, and it's very handy, especially when you're thinking of an adventure. Like, you just open it up to a random page, and you see, oh, there's a GIF. Maybe I'll add that to the adventure, and then, well, why the GIF in an adventure, and what is going to happen with the GIF, and that just gives you an idea of about 4 to 5 sessions right there just to figure out what's going on with the GIF. In the case of a cockatrice, over here, that's more of just a creature that you would find in a dungeon that, you know, would just show up, and you wouldn't necessarily build a whole campaign around them, or even a few sessions around them. It would just be something that you encounter that's kind of scary. So basically, this kind of helps you expand on your imagination, whereas the Dungeon Master's Guide helps you expand on the physical structure of the story. This one kind of guides you in a direction and lets you decide how the story is going to go, whereas the Dungeon Master is more I guess world building, story based. This is more plot based for the Monster Manual. So you've looked at the Dungeon Master's Guide and you looked at the Monster's Manual, and you don't want to spend money on them, so don't. At some point you will want to, because you'll start enjoying playing the game and you'll want access to those things. And if you enjoy the game, you should, buy the products and help support the game. But if you don't want to, don't. Now, you still need the player's guide. I would say, as a dungeon master, players can get by with just the OSL, which is the free online basic rules. But unless you're just starting, you've never played Dungeons and Dragons before, and your players have designated you as the dungeon master, in that case, you can get by with just the basic rules, or in something like the Essentials Kit or a Starter Kit, something like that, the Essentials Kit. You can get by with just the basic rules if you are just absolutely brand new to the game itself. But if you have been playing for a while, you really should have your own player's guide. Just out of, sort of respect, so you're not always using someone else's books. It's just one book to buy. And then, as a dungeon master, if you've played Dungeons and Dragons for a while and you've decided you want a dungeon master, really, the player's guide gives you all the rules you need to know. So, in the last one, we kind of skipped over a lot of the stuff, but in this one, you would start here after the equipment section. So basically, I went through how to build a character, and those are the sections you would need for that. In the case of being a dungeon master, what you need is, after the equipment section, there's the rules on multi-classing, which if you have a player that needs, that wants to have a more, I guess, advanced type of character where they do multiple things, then you would help them work them through that. But that's mostly class stuff. And then there's feats and stuff like that, which are optional rules, which I didn't cover for a player because a new player wouldn't necessarily need to look at any of that stuff. And this is, Chapter 7 is where you first start off looking at the rules and how the rules work and how the interactions with those rules work. So this tells you the ability scores and modifiers and how advantage and disadvantage work, and proficiency bonuses, and then it goes more into it and how each ability gets used and how to basically do checks with your stats, and how to get how to get bonuses and how to get advantage and that kind of stuff. And important thing, which is saving throws. So basically, you're running the game and something happens and you need to know, well, how do I resolve this situation? Like in the case of an example that I already used, which was Acid Splash, you need to know that they have a dexterity save, and if they roll above the difficulty, which is set at the player who did the Acid Splash, that character has a difficulty difficulty setting for their spells, right? So let's say in the case it's the DC is 14. So the person that's having the Acid Splash at them has to roll their dexterity and the modifiers and has to hit 14 or better, at which point they don't take damage from the acid because they dodged out of the way. So that is the kind of thing that section covered in the player's guide, and you'll want to be very familiar with that because you need to know how these things interact. Now, Chapter 8 is a little bit more broad in scope. It just kind of tells you how time and movement work and how to move through how different environments affect different things, and how vision and light work, and eating and social interactions. And this is more of a, well, how do things work when, your characters say, we're going to leave town, we're going to go into these mountains, and you say, well, those mountains are 3 days away. So what's going to happen in those 3 days? Well, they're going to travel either along a road or path or over the open plains or through a forest, and you're going to need to know, well, what can I do while they're doing that? I can either, fast travel them to the mountains, and so they say they leave the town and they're heading towards the mountains, and you say, okay, you're in the mountains now. But you could also decide that a bunch of things happen along the way, because it's not the destination, it's the journey. So it's often better, and I would put that in quotes, better, to basically have things happen along the way and to delay the destination, not infinitely delay it, but basically have encounters happen, or just give them the opportunity to roleplay with each other. Like, they build a campfire and you ask them, well, what do you talk about, or what do you do, or how do you get ready to eat, or how do you get ready to go to bed? Maybe the bard decides they're going to sing a song. Maybe the fighter and the cleric argue over some point of contention about the gods, or maybe while they're sitting around the campfire, some creature comes up and begs them for food, or other creatures come up and attack, or they attack them in the middle of the night while they're sleeping, or they get lost in the forest. That kind of thing, right? So all of that builds a story, and then they get to their destination, and the destination isn't even the end of the story, because they investigate things, and then they figure out where they want to go from there based on their investigations. So that was that more expansive chapter, and it helps you sort of hone your own ideas on what to do. Then Chapter 9, being, I think, probably the most important. While a lot of people want Dungeons & Dragons to be role-playing, everything is role-playing. Combat is also role-playing, because you are not actually stabbing someone in the gut with a sword. You're running a character that's doing that. So all of this is role-playing, whether you're interacting with NPCs, or you're investigating a murder in a room and you're trying to figure out who did it, or if you are traipsing through the mountains trying to find an abandoned mine, or you're stabbing someone in the gut. You're role-playing, and it's the exact same role-playing. Not one is better than the other, they're just different things. And Dungeons & Dragons, specifically, is a combat-heavy role-playing game. The experience points are based on how many things you kill, and have been for a long time. There are optional rules that let you sort of fast-track leveling up, that, you go to the second level after you do one session, or there's like a story mode where you hit certain goals and that kind of thing, and then you have the party level up together. But those are optional rules, and they expand on the idea, and the basic rules are that you get experience after you kill things, after you have encounters, and you can decide that also things running away from you, or you resolving a combat through talking, can also give you experience points. But that's not the basic way that it happens. That's something, a homebrew that you've done yourself. So combat is very important, because a lot of people that play Dungeons & Dragons want a lot of combat. Some people want more NPC interaction, or party planning, or downtime, or exploration, or that kind of stuff. But a lot of people want combat, and a lot of combat. So it's very important to understand how combat works, and that's what Chapter 9 is for. So you go through that, and it helps you deal with different situations that happen in combat, like movement and positioning, and how to move and how to attack, and how flying works, and how to disengage, and how attack rolls work, and what happens if you decide to grapple someone instead of stabbing them, that kind of thing. And then how spells happen in the midst of combat, and how to do mounted combat. It's basically a chapter on combat, and it helps you figure out how to run combat so that you're not doing that on the fly while, you know, you've had your players go into this abandoned temple and encounter a bunch of goblins that attack them, and now you need to figure out, well, how is this combat going to run? And then the next part is, we did go through spell casting in the last one, but mostly we went through just picking people's spells. But this part tells you how spells work, and it's quite short. It's pretty simple. It's straightforward. And as I had mentioned with the player who was starting for the first time, there were some things that they didn't need to necessarily know about their spells, like the components and how they work. As a Dungeon Master, you can decide that they do need to know that, but it's best if you wait until they're more familiar with the game and have them just concentrate on, in the example of Acid Splash, they know that it's instantaneous. You should be more familiar with what one action means, because in a combat round you get one action, one bonus action, one movement action, and you can delay your action to be a reaction instead. And in that case, you can use, you know, either a reaction or one action to cast the spell. You can't use it as a bonus action because this one says one action. And then you should be more familiar with the spell components than a new player, but a player that's played several sessions should be aware of what their own components are, whether it's verbal, somatic, or material, and what those things are. And you may decide that it's not really that important, so you don't really pay attention to it much, and you don't really call the player on it. And so they're just casting spells without using components. However, I would say that the game is kind of balanced for kind of paying attention to components, especially material components, because certain spells are really powerful and require very expensive components, and other power ones are less. And at the early levels, it's not really that important because they're not really necessarily going to run out, unless you're playing a survival type game where, you know, they're running out of food, they're running out of water. Well, then they're also going to be running out of material components, and that can be fun for some people. So if you're running that kind of thing, then you will pay more attention to components. And then, of course, there's a range and what the spell does. So, as I explained to the new player, a new player should record what the spell does on their character sheet, but they don't need to necessarily be aware of it. The Dungeon Master should be. But once someone has played quite a bit, it's their responsibility to know the exact wording of the spell and how it works. And the exact wording is important rather than paraphrasing things, because the game creators used very specific wording for a lot of the spells. So if you paraphrase it, then the spell might do something other than what was intended. So the player themselves, once they're familiar with the game, should be aware of what the spell does and be able to explain to you as the Dungeon Master. And the only time you ever need to know what the spell does is if you refute what they say about the spell, which is a thing that happens in Dungeons & Dragons quite a bit. So you may want to familiarize with what the spells do, but you don't necessarily need to. I mean, there's going to be monsters that you're going to be putting in combat that have a lot of these spells, so you're going to have to look them up. So over time, you're going to become very familiar with pretty much all the spells. Your players are as well. And so basically, the player's guide gives you the outline of how to run the game as the basics. And at the end here, this section here, the Gods of the Multiverse, it seems kind of tacked on. I mean, it's interesting that you learn a little bit about different gods and stuff like that, and it engages your imagination, so that's helpful, but it's more of a Dungeon Master's Guide type of section, I would have thought. And then here, there's some creature statistics. So if you don't have a monster manual, you can use these creatures, especially at early levels. It gets boring after a while because there's only a certain number of them to choose from, but it's fine for your first session. So how do you start that first session? Well, you basically just think of an idea, and the most basic idea is the one that's outlined by a lot of people, and it happens in a lot of different adventures. In the similar ways, they're all kind of the same. And Matt Colville does a great exploration in his first few episodes of his dungeon mastering series. But basically, you have a village. You go into that village. You discover that some of the villagers have been kidnapped, or one villager has been kidnapped. Or I should say your players discover this as you reveal it from different NPCs. Maybe you have them in the market doing whatever, and then someone comes screaming, "My daughter's missing," or whatever, and they decide that they want to help. Now, each of the players may have different reasons for helping. They may only do things for money, and they may do things because it's righteous. They may do things for glory. They may do things for various reasons. So you should be aware of how your players want to play their characters and what things will motivate those characters. And sometimes the player and the character are identical because someone is just starting out and they haven't separated those two things yet. So basically you find ways to engage them. So the person comes screaming, "My daughter is missing. I'll pay you to find them." Someone else says, the person who figures this out will be renowned around the region, that kind of thing. And it will motivate each of your players to get going and figure out why this person is missing and where they are. So they discover that goblin cultists were seen outside of the village. And so they track down these goblin cultists to this abandoned temple, and it has an underground section that is being guarded by goblins, and they figure out how to avoid patrols and get rid of the guards, and then they go into this underground, basically a dungeon, and it has maybe 3-4 rooms, and then there's a final big thing to fight, and then you save the person who's being sacrificed to some evil god, and then you bring them back to the village, and you get rewarded. And also in this underground area, there's traps and also treasure. And after that happens, pretty much everyone is hooked on this game. So they get treasure, they're hooked. They rescue someone, they're hooked. They interacted with random people, and they traveled somewhere, and they figured out patrols, and they figured out how to sneak past the guards or talk their way past things. They're hooked. And that's basically how you start, and you do one session, and then you tell your players, now you can level up to level 2. And then you do other things, and you expand on the story, and, well, why are these cultists doing what they're doing? Is there a wider cultist conspiracy? Or maybe there's something brand new the next time, and it has nothing to do with those cultists because you've already defeated them. The point is that you take a story concept and an idea that you took from a movie, or you took from a book that you read, or you took from an adventure that you found online, or the exact same scenario that I laid out for you, that Matt Colville has laid out for you, and other individuals who tell you how to dungeon master have laid out. So you take those ideas and you build a campaign around it, and you keep playing multiple sessions until people get sick of you, and you get sick of them, and then maybe you start over again after you think, like, oh, I miss playing Dungeons & Dragons. Let's get back together again. And that's kind of how it goes. And that's how you get, at the very beginning, how you get started. And that actually went a lot quicker than I thought it was going to go. So, to sum up, I've basically made 2 episodes here, which is how to get started as a player from the very beginning, and how to get started as a dungeon master. And I'll go into other things. I need to basically explain how the free materials online work, where to get them, and how to navigate those instead of the player's guide. How to make a character in Roll20, how to make a character in D&D Beyond. But for now, that's the basics, and that is how you decide, play Dungeons & Dragons. And I'll just add one thing, that you can either use miniatures or pennies or jelly beans to represent your characters on a grid. You can get grid paper, or you can get a battle mat, that kind of thing, and you can draw on these things and draw a cavern, draw a town, and either use miniatures or other little bits and bobs to represent the enemies and the characters and where they are and where they're positioned, and then that helps you visualize it. There are other people that do just strictly theater of the mind, or a combination of both. And theater of mind is basically, they just describe it to you. As I described that adventure to you, and I've described some of the combat to you, I haven't showed you any combat on grid paper, and I haven't shown you a battle mat that has a town. I haven't showed you pictures or miniatures of the NPCs they encounter. And so that's how some people do it. They just do it in the mind, and they're less precise in their positioning in combat, just because, I mean, I don't think everyone can remember where everyone is and visit and visualize a tactical map in their mind in the exact same way that everyone is visualizing it, which is why a tactical map is sometimes more handy, but there are people that just don't want to do that, and they just want to do theater of the mind. And I wanted to tell you that's an option, and if that is something that you and your players like, then that is something that you should do. Because at the end of the day, it's about you and your friends having fun, and you guys being responsible for each other's fun. So, until the next episode, thanks a lot, and check out some of my other videos. So this has been my short series about how to get started in Dungeons & Dragons from the very beginning, from a player's perspective and a Dungeon Master's perspective. I'm going to then start another series, with, if you're a player that you've been playing for a while, or a Dungeon Master, and have been Dungeon Mastering for a while, and we'll get more into, more depth into both Dungeon Mastering and playing. So if you're interested in that, stick around and check out more of my videos.